In this lesson, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about gaps in the language of friendship, or the other way to think about it is relationships and how people build relationships, and more importantly, how trust is based across different cultures. So let's just start with another one of these little scenarios to think through. So I guess give this a little bit of thought, what you think about this situation. Zhao, the sales manager for a region in China, is planning to make a trip to your Bloomington headquarters. Okay, right? So not so uncommon to think about having visitors. And this is this person's first visit to the U.S. and to Minnesota. And an administrative assistant books her a local hotel and sets her up with a rental car. Okay, so, it might be reasonable to think this is an employee, this is an independent person. They're going to want to need to get around. It's not the easiest to get around Minneapolis, particularly suburban Twin Cities. If you don't have a car, we don't have public transit like somebody might be used to in other places. So that might have been thought of as a nice gesture to give this person some independence and freedom. So she's arriving Sunday morning, and you have an agenda full of meetings starting bright and early at 8:30 in the morning. So I'd like you to just spend a little bit of time thinking about any issues you think there could be going on here, any concerns you might have for this setup, and why. More importantly, probably why. So one thing that comes to my mind here is, maybe no cultural differences are involved, and we would just generally think this would be kind of a rude thing to do, to allow an international traveler to come in for a visit and not greet them or meet them or pick them up. But I just went to London for work just before Thanksgiving, and I didn't expect my hosts at London Business School to meet me at the airport. I just figured it out on my own how I was going to take the Heathrow Express into Paddington Station. I'd never been to London before, and get myself to my hotel. And quite honestly, my attitude was, oh, I'll be so exhausted after this trip. I don't really want to see anybody right away. I want to go to the hotel, maybe sleep a little bit, take a shower, try to refresh myself, and then think about connecting with people. And in my case as well, in that particular trip, I flew in to arrive on a Saturday with the intention of doing some exploration on my own. So this is sort of, my expectations, and I wasn't surprised when I wasn't greeted at the airport. So I guess I'm just sharing that because I don't think it's unusual to think about a professional adult, flying in and kind of making their own way to where they're staying, or finding their way around. However, what we'll discuss in this lesson is that there's really a very different sense of trusting and relationships and expectations for treatment, even in the business world, in terms of what would be expected of hospitality. And I can say that given kind of traditional or typical approaches to relationships and expectations of relationships and trust, and the basis for trust in China, this experience would very well might likely be a rather big affront to not greet and not bring this person. In some situations, depending on the specific country, even going as far as staying in a hotel might be seen as a little bit of an affront. But again, this depends a little bit on industry and company and global business norms as well. But at the very least, I think there would be some expectation for a personal greeting. And given that there was some time, for an offer at least for a meal and maybe a tour of the area. Certainly not the idea that you're going to arrive and have no contact, no social time before immediately starting into an endless set of meetings. So let's dig into just this a little bit more to think about the variations that we might be observing with respect to relationships and trusting around the world. So what Ed Hall calls the silent language of friendship is another one of these just sort of socialized sets of expectations about how we relate to one another and what is the basis of a friendship, what's the formation of a friendship. And I mentioned this already in one of our classes, that experience of formality in Germany, where people may not start to use the informal you, which is du, du, and may end up using the formal sie, sie, sometimes for years, sometimes with coworkers or neighbors that a person may have known for 20 years, they may not use the du. So this idea of, how often people make new friends is distinct across cultures. There are places in the world where friendship groups from a young age are very tight, and there are expectations. I mentioned that in class, that there's expectations that you stay connected to people from your childhood, and even more so that you have obligations to those people. And in Japan, there's even special words for those people that you went to elementary school with, and a deep sense of reciprocity that if they need something, you're going to help them. Whether that's recommendations, whether that's jobs, whether that's business relationships, preferential choice as suppliers or customers. All of those things are connected to history of relationships, and that varies around the world. So yes, the persistence of friendship. What are the obligations of friendship, right? What is required of you if you're a friend? And how far are you expected to go to help a friend? Varies quite a bit around the world. And then finally, I think another interesting thing is like what does a friend do? How do they represent that you are a friend to them? And one interesting example that was given to me by an Indian student, actually not an Indian student, it was a U.S. student who had a very close Indian friend ultimately, but said that early on in the relationship, this friend from India was relatively polite. If the student asked for some feedback from the Indian friend, there would maybe be some kind of mild form of discussion that would happen. And what my student said is that, but it was very interesting. They had been together as friends for quite a while, and the student felt they were friends. And there was a point at which the Indian friend started to become much more critical. And the U.S. student felt like, oh, something's wrong. We've had a falling out. This friendship isn't working anymore. And fortunately, through some conversation, she didn't kind of shun the friend or think it was over. Discovered that in India, once you, and again, I say that in a very broad brush stroke, but one tendency is that once you are close friends, you actually feel the safeness and the trust to give somebody very blunt and honest feedback. And frankly, once somebody is doing that to you, it is actually a sign that they see you as a friend and that they deeply trust you, that they're willing to give you this kind of blunt and, I think what would feel to us, especially in Minnesota, maybe excessive critical feedback. So, these are kind of these great experiences where what we think is a friendship isn't really a friendship, because the sort of polite, caring feeling might not actually indicate the deep trust that the more critical, blunt feedback actually indicates. And so I think that there's these kind of fun metaphors here to sort of think about the differences. And one way that U.S. culture has been sort of denoted in terms of friendship is that we're like a peach. We have a very soft exterior. We're very much socialized to smile and be gregarious and meet people and ask lots of questions and, apparently build friendships really quickly. But, inside of a peach is that pit. And there's a sense that, in fact, this is sort of a soft exterior, and you might hit a hard pit at some point where you suddenly realize maybe I'm not really a friend because I'm not letting you into that inner self or that inner circle. So U.S., there's sort of a veneer of friendship and a veneer of quick trust among people, but in fact, oftentimes it's not really present. On the contrary, other parts of the world are denoted as coconuts, this very kind of rough exterior shell. And so, when you first meet somebody, you feel like, wow, they're not ever going to be my friend. They're not interested in getting to know me. But if you can get past that shell and get into that kind of soft, tasty center of the coconut, then there is this deep, deep friendship to develop. So it takes longer, slower burn, more requirements, more hoops to get through to be considered a friend. But then once a friend, really considered a friend. And that is kind of more of my experience with some of my friends from Germany. So let's talk a little bit more about how we look at countries on a continuum here. So another way to think about this idea of, the language of friendship, or the idea of where and what is the basis for trust and relationships around the world, is to kind of compare the so-called task-based, which we can also think of as cognitive trust. So if you think about it, it's thinking-based trust. I'm not very good at this writing on this side. And on the other end is more relationship-based trust, or affective-based, kind of the affection, emotion, connection-based trust is on the other end of the spectrum over here. So if we think about task-based trust, this is where, you show and develop trust by reciprocating and doing what you say you're going to do. So if you think about this again, I think it is related to low context communication. So low context communication, the message is in the words, and in task-based trust cultures, the trust is developed from sort of explicit contractual agreements and explicit direct language. So, work relationships are built and dropped easily, right? So you might know somebody at work, but you transfer jobs and you lose touch with those people. There's a much more kind of practicality of situational needs and demands, and people generate relationships for sort of tactical, instrumental purposes, and may not really try very hard to build those relationships, must be much beyond the kind of work-based needs that people want. Basically people are trusted if they are seen as consistent, if they're seen as reliable, and if they sort of have a general sense of enjoyment working together. So, not surprisingly, I think to most of us, the U.S. is way over here on the left side in terms of task-based trust. We've already discussed that we are one of the most explicit-based communication. I think the only ones that are sort of lower context are Switzerland and Germany than the U.S. And for the most part, these are tactical-based, rational-based, kind of cognitive-based trusting countries. There's sort of a bunch in the middle here, and then way over on the right side are these relationship-based cultures, where trust is based on interpersonal, social time outside of work. And frankly, you will not develop trust, and you will not likely succeed in building work relationships, getting contracts, completing work, having people meet your demands, if you have not put the time in, really quite literally outside of work, to develop the social relationships. And in these societies, those relationships are going to build slowly over time. It's going to take a while. People don't naturally automatically trust. They want to know something more about you. They want to know something about where you're from. They might want to know more about your family. Things that to us over here in the task-based end of the spectrum might feel like they're too personal, like they're probing, like it's inappropriate interactions, perhaps. I don't necessarily mean in a Me Too or sexual harassment way. I mean, just like we're supposed to be doing work, we should keep work, right? That kind of mentality is more common in the task-based world. So, what you can see is, again, there's a little bit of breakdown of, I think, more developing nations, more Middle East, and more Southern Hemisphere, probably with the exception of that, Russia and Japan, for sure, China as well. So, most places outside of North America and Western Europe are going to be much more on this affective, trust-based end of things. And again, remember that this is all relative. If you are in the US, you might feel that Germany is more, takes longer, takes a long time to develop those relationships. If you are in Poland, and you're kind of looking at Saudi Arabia, even though Poland to the US would feel much more relationship based. And I can attest to that from the viewpoint of the US, Polish society has a lot more of this kind of expectation of social time, making personal connections, having meals before we get to work, understanding each other. But again, compared to the Middle East, compared to India, Poland is going to seem like a cold, hard, calculated place. Compared to the US, it's going to seem much more like this is sort of nepotistic. People seem to do deals with only people they know. There's a lot of pressure for socializing outside of work. Again, it's all kind of a relative positioning on this continuum. And so, some of the implications of this that I think are important to keep in mind are that, if you are engaged in work with people, if you're from the US, which is the perspective for most of us in class, and you are engaged in work with people from a relationship-based country or culture, you will need to invest time in building those social relationships. It's going to be important for you to spend some time socializing, chit-chatting, getting to know people. I knew of a situation once where someone had kind of a set of people that kind of a young team they needed to work with in Mumbai. And there's ways to think about how do you make those personal connections. And this particular person decided that he would look up some pop culture and pop music references from Indian pop music. And then, as part of a team meeting and team call, decided to ask, hey, I heard this music, I kind of like this song, what do you think about it? And humorously, the team was like, oh, that's like music my little sister would like. No way, we don't like it. But it opened a door and a window maybe, and they started giving this manager some suggestions for different pop music to listen to and Indian pop music that they liked. And it was sort of a transformative thing in terms of starting to build more of a relationship. When frankly, prior to that, this person had sort of shared frustration that they felt like they always got a yes and an answer that everything was fine, and they didn't end up delivering. And there was frustration in a sense that this leader didn't feel like he was getting honest answers, right? So he labeled that as not honest. But in fact, what it was there wasn't enough trust built up yet for the team to feel like they could tell their boss something was wrong, because the power distance present there alongside of this kind of need for relationship-based trust meant that was unlikely to happen. It was unlikely for people to feel comfortable contradicting what they thought the boss believed, or being willing to say or share some more blunt feedback. So again, as you're sitting here in the US, things that will feel to us like they're trivial, or if they will feel to us like they're a waste of time, in most of the rest of the world are absolutely essential to build the relationships to actually conduct work in a productive way. So just, in closing here, to think a little bit more about, this idea of the language of friendship and how trust is developed. And trust is one of those essential, vital things in terms of performance and work as the kind of basis for conducting work. So if we're sitting in a task-based culture in particular, and we're thinking about wanting to build relationships, I think it's really vital to keep in mind that the relationship is the contract. So I think people end up feeling very frustrated that they, especially in the U.S., kind of come in with this lawyers. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes that can be made is coming in with a whole, fleet of lawyers with all the contracts and feeling like we're all ready to go, and then being surprised that there's resistance and that, in fact, the agreements aren't able to be made, and that we sometimes then feel like, oh, there's obfuscation happening, people are changing their minds, they're not really wanting to do business. All of that kind of stuff will come up when a task-based leader shows up in a relationship-based situation and doesn't recognize the need to develop the relationships first. And in fact, in extreme cases in relationship-based cultures, there may be strong resistance to contracts at all, and a certain level of offense taken if a contract is presented. Now, that doesn't mean that global business culture doesn't understand legalities, but there may be circumstances where that might backfire, and developing the relationship so that people trust one another enough that the word is the case in many places. Another thing that really is important if you're working with people from relationship-based cultures is to show your non-professional self, right? And I don't mean don't be unprofessional, or I don't mean be unprofessional or be disrespectful, but people need to know something more about who you are and where you come from. And that often is connected to family. It is kind of connected to some sense of placing you in a context. So remember, again, this is like high context cultures. You can't just be your independent work self. People need to understand something deeper about yourself. So what might, again, feel like to us from the U.S., extraneous, unnecessary, none of my business, in fact, might be the most essential thing you can do to build the foundation for effective co-working and collaboration. It's also good to kind of really pressure yourself to think not about this as like wasted time or delay, but that in fact, if you build the relationships, the social connection, ask people about their families, ask them about their hobbies and interests and what they're doing outside of work, their children, things will go smoother later when you're talking about building this in a relationship-based culture. It's also, important to see sometimes relationship-based cultures go off and have very long social lunches. Again, that's all time where people are sort of sussing you and vetting you and thinking about, is this a person I want to build a relationship with? And quite honestly, the business-related, B2B kinds of relationships in these cultures, people want to have repeat long-term business. So they're trying to understand if you're really in it for a long-term relationship, or if you're just showing up kind of on the market and all you want is to do something, get in and get out. And that might be what you're looking for, but don't be surprised if you don't get things delivered on time, if you don't get the quality you're looking for, if you don't get the results you want, if you're trying to do business like that in a relationship-based culture. And finally, I think a lot of our work ends up getting done over email, but phone and face-to-face is going to be really important in those relationship based cultures. We had a little conversation about that in the Van den Bosch case, that Van den Bosch probably could have made a big difference if he had just picked the phone up to Mendoza and just called. I think this actual scenario might have been long enough ago that those international calls were extremely expensive, and so people tended not to do those as much. But the reality is, email will feel impersonal and cold. And so if you have opportunities to do something else, like some kind of web-based, video-based interaction, and even better, at least to spend some time visiting or having sort of co-located work at times, is really going to be important. And even socializing in an email, right? We talked about that with Van den Bosch as well, that this was a conflict-based email, and he didn't even kind of acknowledge that this was a colleague and that this is somebody he cared about and wanted to build and maintain a relationship alongside of really delivering, excellence together with the customer. So, it's important to think about mimicking what you might do in face-to-face communication, and not being just sort of only the facts or down to business in these situations. So I encourage you to think a little bit more, look at the maps, think about where your countries lie on that continuum, and think about adjusting your behaviors. Think about working harder to extend the relationship, the professional relationship, frankly, to the personal, and learning more about each other and trying to build some basis that goes beyond task.